Okay, good morning, everyone. Starting with this deck, just to jog your memory for any questions that you might have or need to be answered. As I said, unfortunately, Michael Fritz is not available today and has asked me to fill in. I'll do my best to answer all questions that are fielded, and if I'm not able to get back to you on this call, I will make a note and find out the answers for you and get back to you via email. Please let me know, even if you're not the one that asked the question, if it so happens that you want to get the same answer as asked by somebody else so that I can copy you on the email. Please participate. I can only rely on hearing from you every so often, so please feel free to stop me, to ask questions, to make comments. We are still open to improvements on these decks particularly, so please feel free to make suggestions as you feel necessary. As I said previously, my name is Judith, and I hope to hear from each of you as we go through the session. The new services that we need to offer for or around Enable Now, just to give you a little bit of background, are based on the fact that we needed to standardize the way we deliver Enable Now services globally. The expectation is that we should all deliver the same type of services. We have had situations where, because of the lack of clarity around how to approach the delivery of the services, everybody does different things at different customers as they provide the services. So this is meant to give all of us some guidelines on how to effectively deliver and um, be able to sing the same song to our customers. And it also helps us in case somebody has to pick up on a service delivery that you started or follow up on it. We are able to understand what one or the other did previously based on the standardization. The look and feel that you'll see in this deck is more or less what you'll see in all of the decks that are available. There are several of them. There are various phases of deployment, and the scope documents or the commercial documents are in the process of being prepared as we speak. Sorry about that. I had to mute there. So the first part of the services is called the preparation phase, and you will see that we have various blocks in the preparation phase itself, followed by the other phases that you'll see here. This one is one that we mandatorily ask that it be included in the services, because we've often found ourselves in situations where we arrive on site at a customer and waste a lot of time trying to ensure that the necessary prerequisites are met when we're already on site. So the purpose of this part of the phase is to ensure that all preparations that need to be done in advance before going on site are done and confirmed, and that there is no time wasted and mutual frustration for all parties involved once on site. In parallel, or soon after the start of the preparation phase, we would often do the technical implementation phase. A lot of the preparation phase has to do with preparing for the technical implementation. So that is why you see that block kind of overlapping or running in parallel with the technical implementation. That, from a cloud perspective, is ensuring that the customer's environment is provisioned, that they have their welcome email that contains all of their details, and from an on-premise perspective, ensuring that they're aware of all of the options that they have, depending on the database they have chosen for their on-premise implementation, and are able to get all the prerequisites ready for that on-site implementation. That then is, once we have completed the technical implementation, we follow on with the strategy and configuration, and that's where the workshops take place, the analysis, strategy and design workshops, to understand in detail what the customer's requirements and use cases are for Enable Now, and then proceed to do all the customizing, branding, information architecture or content structuring for them based on the decisions out of that workshop. That workshop, or those workshops, are the main input for the deliverable document that we ultimately give to the customer at the end of our services. We begin it as a draft document that we work on together with the customer, and it is part of what forms the sign-off for the whole deployment that we do at the customer. I know that there are some samples or templates of that document, and if you have not seen it or you're not aware of what it contains, in summary, it contains all of the decisions that would have been made in the strategy analysis and design workshops, the customizing and design and structuring information, as well as any other decisions around the general behavior required or configured by the customer. Are there any questions at this point? Okay, so finally, after the strategy and configuration phase, the enablement phase kicks in. It's important to do the enablement phase after strategy and configuration, because as much as possible, in the limited time that we have for the enablement, which is your author training, we need to deliver to relevance. So we often try to make sure that we are training our authors based on the decisions that have been made by the organization, and we are not focusing on topics that are not priority for that customer. The last phase is the coaching and life cycle. That of course depends on the size of services that the customer would have bought or signed up for with Enable Now. In most cases, if they have the full, what we previously called Smart Start, and it's 16 days, then there is room for us to be able to come back, usually when they are in content production or preparing to begin content production, ideally when they've started and they realize that they need refresher training or additional enablement to meet new requirements that may have come up, or they want to access features and functionality that were originally not priority. We use the coaching and life cycle phase for that requirement. The decks that will be shared will give you an idea of pretty much everything that I have just summarized, together with estimate durations for each of the phase, depending on which service package the customer would have signed up for. That's why you see there on the duration 1 to 2 days for preparation and 1 to 4 days for the technical implementation, also allowing for unknowns or unforeseens that could go wrong, especially in that technical implementation phase, especially when it's on premise. You'll see up to 12 days for the strategy and configuration, and that is made up of both on-site and remote services, depending on project scope and overall complexity. I'm pausing for questions or comments. Is it clear so far? Does it make sense how we are planning to deliver the new services? I know that a few of us have had opportunity to kind of test drive, especially Michael has had an opportunity to test drive this um, deployment approach and has gotten very good feedback from the customers seen so far. Are there any questions, or do you see any gaps for us to consider improving on this approach? I see someone has unmuted, but I'm not sure if that is to ask a question or by mistake. Okay, then I will proceed. So we've covered the preparation, the technical implementation, and the strategy and configuration. And since there are no questions, I take it that everyone is comfortable with the approach shared so far. The enablement, as I mentioned previously, the duration shown there is 3 to 10 days, usually on site. Most customers prefer that it is on site. Personally, I have found it very challenging to deliver author enablement remotely or to a split audience where one is online and one is in person or in the same room. So I would recommend there that you try as much as possible to ensure that that part of the deployment takes place on site, and where it is possible or can be helped, that audience is not split. As you know, you would often have participants that are struggling with a certain step, and if you cannot see their screens or are constantly having to ask them to share their screens if they're online, it delays the rest of the class. It's just much more efficient to have that part of the deployment on site. Um, the coaching phase is also another one that is worthwhile going on site for. Of course, it depends on the customer's setup. I've seen instances where we've had to exercise a little bit more flexibility with that one in terms of allowing the customer to come to us with questions as they are developing, usually via email or via phone calls. And in that case, if you find that you have to exercise that level of flexibility, I would recommend that you ring fence it as much as possible with the customer. Make sure that expectations are managed so that when you are charging the customer for that time, it is well understood what the uh, service level agreement is in terms of emails, or usually I prefer that the customer consolidate all of their requirements and that you then run a session based on some preparation that you would have done, maybe a half day or 2 half days, depending on the scope, to go over all of the consolidated topics and address the questions or the requirements positioned. In some customers, usually our larger customers, we have the requirement for what we are calling life cycle services, and that is to provide uh, additional coaching. So over and above the 5 or so days spoken of in the previous phase, to provide additional services to keep Enable Now alive in the organization. So that's why you see their health checks and business assessments. There might be a requirement for update workshops, maybe due to changes in the customer organization, maybe rebranding requirements, maybe attrition that has resulted in previously trained authors no longer being within the organization and a new crop of authors needing to be trained. It also could be that there are integration requirements, like the customer has now purchased Solution Manager or decided that they would like that integration as well as their business process models integration, like your Aris and Symbio, all those of which are not part of the standard deployment unless specifically uh, listed in the scope or defined in the scope, and that can be part of the life cycle services or the coaching services. Same with the EPSS strategy sessions. It could be that there is a requirement that is well beyond just author enablement that is given in the standard deployment of the enablement phase. So we may need to do additional coaching and lifecycle services to focus on those topics and deploy the EPSS of choice for the customer. Similar to that, SCORM and LMS workshops might need to take place depending on which one the customer uses and how we can perform that integration. And as you can see there, the duration is not as straightforward to define because it is based on the requirements at that given time. So overall, this is an overview of the entire service broken down into the various phases that we would need to execute at the customer together with the suggested or um, proposed durations for each of the phases. I think this gives a fairly good overview of what the expectation would be and what sort of durations and what sort of flow we need to follow in order to deploy. I think what's important to note here is that we are trying, or rather recommending based on past experience, that if, for example, your customer service contract is for 15 days of Enable Now services, it is not necessarily consecutive days. Typically, after the preparation phase, hopefully a week in advance, but more ideally 2 weeks in advance, depending on whether it's cloud or on-premise or how far the customer is from a readiness perspective. There should be some time in between, especially between the preparation and the technical implementation if there is a lot to prepare, so that you are not having to go on site and find a lot of the prerequisites not met by the customer. So that's why you see below there that we have the service will be delivered over 6 weeks, excuse me, even though we have about 15 to 20 days in terms of the actual number of working days for that phase. Are there any questions, any comments? Let me remind you that this is a Q&A session, so please feel free to ask questions. That's the whole purpose. I am going through these slides just to give you a refresher on what Michael already shared, and hoping that as I go through them, you will be able to come up with questions or comments to fulfill the purpose of the session. So please put your hand up, unmute yourself, and make comments, good or bad, we'll take them and apply whatever feedback we need to apply to improve or to keep going if you guys think it's good. Christina, please go ahead.
Hi, Judith. I know I'm
Hello.
not a consultant anymore, but one question that I get a lot from customers is who do we need on our side for these workshops? So is there a list of customers, stakeholders, or roles that need to be involved in each of the phases?
Yes, there is. In the previous documents that we had for the smart site services, we did have a page-by-page breakdown of who the participants should be in those workshops. So in this new services, we have similar. With each phase, we have what we call an internal delivery document. And for each of the phases in that internal delivery document is a list of the participants that would best be suited to attend that workshop. So I will share those with you for each of the phases as well.
Great.
For strategy and configuration in particular, it is usually those that are empowered to make decisions around all of the topics that we will share. So, for example, we need the inputs from a customizing and design perspective of the organization's branding leads. They are the ones that need to give us the approved logos, the approved color palettes for the Enable Now environment. So we need some documents from them. Usually
Mhm.
they have their own branding guidelines, and we need to be able to access them to give final approval. For the information architecture piece, that is related to the structuring as far as what the content library for the customer will look like. So we need um, usually the business stream leads or um, the project manager. So we do have a list of the various options of participants or recommended participants, and it includes all the options and also lets the customer know that if some of the roles that are listed do not exist, we just need the people who would be able to make the relevant decisions for each of those blocks. Does that
Mhm.
answer your question?
Yes, thanks, Judith.
Thanks, Christina. Any other questions?
Just a quick one. Um, with the different structure to what we had before, the different SEN consultants that we have and the different resources with their skill level, um, we have kind of an idea of which consultant could deliver what. Now that we split it in different ways, especially with the technical parts, do we know which consultants are on a skill level to do just one of those bits? And is the plan to split those different segments into different people when we have a customer who wants to run through all of it?
Yes, we know who of our consultants can deliver which parts of the phase. We are pretty open in general or in terms of their comfort levels with the various phases. In most cases, it makes sense to have one consultant deliver, but I think, as you mentioned, Moritz, the technical implementation could be a challenge for some that are not technically inclined. So I have seen cases where we have that split that says the technical implementation is handled by one consultant and the strategy configuration, enablement and coaching are handled by another consultant. For my personal finding is that for cloud implementations, it's a lot easier to have one consultant because there is a lot less technical preparation for them to do or for the consultant to do, because a lot of it is handled by the cloud team, and a lot of it can be supported through a ticket or expert sessions if the customer has access to that service. It is usually more for the on-premise implementations that I find we have to do that split. So the regional champions maintain a database of the consultants in their region, and based on that, we have a view of which consultants have which skills levels, and we work together with the resourcing team to validate the chosen consultants for the different service types.
So that means if we are asking a consultant to deliver a service for a customer and he's kind of not sure about the technical part, we can tell him that we have the option to split that day out and get a resource for the technical implementation and then move on with the other resource.
That's right. And
That is something everybody should understand, that we can split services to make it fit to everybody.
Thanks, Moritz. Good point. And I think the technical implementation is easy to split out because it can be done remotely. In most cases, it's not something that is mandatorily done on site. So therefore, there would be no additional travel cost for us or the customer to take care of by splitting resources on that assignment. Are there any questions or comments around that? Okay, I just want to talk a little bit about the EPSS specialist that you see in the green block, the enablement block. That service is mainly targeted at focusing on web assistant or desktop assistant deployment, depending on the customer's requirements. So it's not something that we had previously or in the previous set of services. What we did have previously is your standard author training and master author / project manager training. In the EPSS specialist training, we have dedicated time for whomever, and so this would not be the wider audience that would have attended the previous 2 blocks of training. We have usually 1 or 2 individuals that are focusing on deploying web assistant or desktop assistant and giving them focused training on best practices and editing enablement for those 2 because of the significantly different way of managing content for web assistant in particular, and also for desktop assistant. So with that one, you'll see that the duration has changed from 15 days that we had previously to 20 days, and that delivery would now be over 7 weeks. And that, again, we would expect that after the initial preparation workshop or call and kickoff, we have about a week before we start with the strategy and configuration to allow the necessary preparations to be made. You'll also see in the decks that we will have a specific slide for cloud versus on-premise. So that you will find to be in the same deck, and when you are presenting to the customer, you obviously need to remove the slides that are not relevant for that particular deployment. So please look out for these headers or notes that would be on the deck that let you know which particular type of customer that would be for. This is a different type of service. So I mentioned previously that we have various packages from a service perspective for Enable Now, just like we did previously, but structured a little differently. This one is the standard service called Explore Enable Now, and it's for the Cloud Edition. It reduces the durations, as you can see, because it's a shorter service. You have your preparation phase over half a day instead of the 1 to 2 days that we saw previously in total. And also you have your technical implementation over half a day, which is quite possible for cloud because the infrastructure is prepared already. more or less the same duration for strategy and configuration, because we consider that to be the most crucial part of the deployment. That is where the customer's decisions and the customer's enable now configuration are determined, and that speaks to what comes afterwards in terms of the services that are delivered afterwards, and in terms of how the customer handles the life cycle of enable now in their organization. If we don't get it right at strategy and configuration, we are at the risk of deploying a product or a tool in the customer environments that has a very shortened life cycle. So that phase is important to ensure that we deploy a service that lives long after we've left in the customer organization. So that's why you see that that phase is kept at what you would have seen in the previous phases, even if the service package is a smaller one. The enablement in this case would be handled through Learning Hub. So this is where if the customer has Learning Hub subscriptions and have expressed enough comfort, or uh, have signed up for this package and have chosen to take their author enablement without our support, they would then access SEN 100, 200, and 300, which enable now are SEN 10, 20, and 30. The coaching and life cycle services again has a dotted line around it. We recommend 5 days. Why 5 days? Because we have not had opportunity to train their authors ourselves. We don't have any insight apart from perhaps their Learning Hub subscription, and if they share with us the reporting around that as to how far they've gone with actually taking the SEN 10, 20, and 30 courses, we are very likely not able to have details into the level of author enablement that they have undertaken. And so we see an increased number of coaching days there to get them up to speed and to support them fully in their content production. This service is delivered over 3 weeks. So again, you'll see varying recommendations depending on the service package and depending on what's realistic for the customer. Of course, these time guidelines, duration guidelines are very strong recommendations, but we do have to allow for some flexibility once we are talking to the customer and understanding the situation on the ground. Are there any questions on this one? Does it make sense?
Yes, if no one else talks, then I'll talk. Yes, that makes sense.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you, Christina. Okay, so I'll move on to deploy Web Assistant, which is specifically focused on the cloud edition in this case, and incorporates compressed author and project manager training that you see in the green block, as well as the EPSS specialist one-day enablement service. This one is focused specifically on web assistance. So especially in North America, we have customers that are not at all looking at anything else from a content production perspective other than web assistant based content. So I think if you're interested in this topic in particular, you should also join the afternoon session or access the recording, because that is going to be run by my colleague Andy Fian, who is or was the regional champion for North America, and he has most of his Enable Now services purely based on web assistant deployment, meaning that as far as the content production and the related author enablement, they do not typically touch anything in producer at all, or very much, or at least not to the level that we get as far as standard author training and master author training are concerned. So the compressed author training goes over the basics in terms of how to execute a recording and how to manage the work area for guided help and context help based topics. And then thereafter, it's purely based on the web assistant based editing, as well as management of web assistant content and all of those topics. So again, for this service, you will see the decks that point to the links to be focused on out of the info center that the training should come from. So for each of the enablement phase blocks, there are slides, and within those slides, there are the topics listed that should be trained in that enablement phase. And within that enablement phase, the topics that are available on the info center are linked directly, and then once again supported by an internal delivery document to help you understand what the flow of the training is and what to focus on each of the topic areas. I will show that once I've been through these slides. Any questions or comments? So this is an overview of all of the implementation phases. Again, we're still talking about the cloud edition. I think in most cases, our customers are going for cloud anyway, and that is what we recommend. So you'll see a big focus on the cloud deployment. There are a lot of similarities in some cases, or well, apart from the technical implementation and preparation phase, and as well as the web assistant focused deployment, there are enough similarities to be able to use the decks in any case, but you will see a split in slides as the deck is shared. Here are the deployment options for the on-premise edition. So some slight differences as you saw, but the topics more or less remain the same. The differences are largely in the duration. So if you look at the technical implementation for the core deployment of Enable Now for cloud, you'll see less amount of time given and slightly more for the on-premise deployment, but the topics remain the same, apart from the EPSS specialist training, depending on which database the customer has chosen for on-premise, as far as the possibility to integrate Web Assistant is concerned. Yes, question, comment? Okay, so that was the end of the overview deck as far as the services that we will be offering, as far as what those look like. We are about 45 minutes in, or about 40 minutes since we started. I'd like to encourage questions at this point once again, and if there are no questions, possibly pause for a break before we return. Yes.
Just a quick one. If you go to the last slide, please. Maybe it's just me, but I still have slide 2 on my screen.
Oh.
I also see slide 2.
And now?
Yeah. Oh, well, at least. Yeah, good. So with deploy SAP enable now core or core and EPSS with the yellow lines, and then explore SAP enable now and deploy web assistant. Just a comment on that slide. It looks like you could deploy web assistant without anything else for 15 days. I understood that deploy web assistant will be an add-on once you already did and SAP enable now implementation, right?
No, you could deploy Web Assistant independently of the others. So that could be an independent service that does not necessarily require the core deployment as a, well, at least not the standard deployment as a mandatory service. So that's more or less what I mentioned is the case with North America, where they typically don't even go into strategy analysis and design workshops to the same level, only focus on web assistant based content and not at all, if I can call it, producer and instant producer based content.
Okay, that's our strategy here, because that worries me a little bit. If I was sales, I would say, okay, cool. Let's just do the web assistant. Looks fancy. Let's just sell that one and then just do that 15 days. And then we most probably really missed the major part of enabling the customer on setting up a proper manager and a manager structure. And it just
think
worries me. I understand that we can do it, but I'm not sure if this is the right strategy right now.
I think it arose as a result of the demand of the customers from that region. I don't think it was a deliberate, or that it is a deliberate strategy on our part, because we understand the disadvantages. I think it has to be one of the options, in particular for North America, North American customers that are insisting on purely web assistant based services and deployments.
Okay, I'll park that. I'll discuss it separately.
Yeah, I know that Mike has had some discussions as well with Andy around it, and I understand your concerns and share them. So I completely agree with you and understand, but I think the option is available for the customers that will take nothing else, basically, if we don't offer this option.
Okay, I'll park it. I'll make it a separate discussion. Talk to
Sure.
Mike.
Okay. Thanks, Moritz.
Thanks.
Any other questions or comments? Okay, let's take a break. After the break, I will share an overview of the other decks, maybe just one to give you an example of what you would expect to see in the decks, and invite further questions on those ones, and also want to talk a little bit about the internal delivery documents that will provide the guideline or the basis on how you read those decks and follow them through in front of customer. I'm going to stop the recording for now. Let's return. I think 7 minutes should be sufficient. We should probably take another half hour or so after the break, unless you have more questions and would like to go over anything else. So is that fine? Do you need 5 minutes, 10 minutes?
All good.
All good for 5. Okay. I see 5. I'll take that. So see you in 5. Thank you. Okay, thanks for coming back, everyone, and confirming that you are here to resume. Please feel free once again to stop me, pop in a comment in the chat or over the audio to let me know what your questions or your comments are on any of what we're sharing. So before the break, we shared the high-level overview deck of the entire services deployment together with the options that are now possible in the new services deployment approach. I'm just showing you an example of one or two slide decks together with the delivery documents, which we're calling internal delivery documents that are for the purposes of giving you some guidelines in terms of how to approach the deployment since it's fairly new. You will see that we are still calling, in particular, the delivery documents a work in progress. We're still inviting and taking inputs and improving those documents, but we believe that in most cases you will have enough clarity either from the decks themselves or from the framework that is given in the guideline documents in terms of how to approach the delivery. Right now, I'm showing the core team kickoff session slides, which is our first one after the preparation phase, how to handle that particular part of the service. You will see the same format in each of the decks. They will have an objective and outcome section that gives you and the customer an idea of what we're hoping to achieve and what the outcome of each of the sessions should be. In this particular case, we would normally do this as a remote service and expect that it would be about 2 to 4 hours in terms of time to spend on this one. And of course, you also see that we recommend at least 2 to 3 weeks prior to the first on-site workshop. And this is part of the preparation phase block that we mentioned earlier. The customer core team would expect out of this phase, or we should deliver to them out of this phase, an understanding of the stages of the services that we're going to offer. And in order for them to fully understand what we are deploying and what we're talking about when we talk Enable Now, this particular session delivers an extended solution demo and also gets an understanding of the customer's context, so that by the time we are going on site, we are focusing on relevant topics for the customer. And then, of course, the logistical preparation together with the scheduling of the upcoming phase. So these decks, you will see that you can share directly with the customer, but look out for the parts of the decks that have an internal note for you to remove and take note of separately, or for the hidden slides that should not be presented to the customer, especially when you share the deck afterwards, as customers typically expect. Always remember to remove your hidden slides from the deck that you share with the customer. So this you've seen in the previous deck shared, a little bit more detail zooming in to the preparation phase. So this deck that I'm sharing is to give the customer an idea of where we are in the deployment. We would have already completed the infrastructure overview session, the technical preparation calls, and if the customer is a cloud customer, their cloud tenant would already have been provisioned. So before we even start these discussions, we already have a signed contract with the customer and are beginning the services based on a signed contract. The core team kickoff session is the blue block that you see there in the preparation phase, and it could overlap with the completion of the technical implementation phase as well, depending on the customer setup. There is also a light gray block that talks about the handover between the technical or from the technical consultant, and this is to the point that Moritz raised earlier, which is to say it could be that we would have split resources for the service, and the technical consultant would have done their part, and at this point would be handing over to the functional Enable Now consultant to continue the rest of the deployment. We are also encouraging in these services that the customer formally accepts that the preparation phase steps and all the other phase steps have been completed, um, just to safeguard ourselves from a service quality delivery perspective. It is often easier to get sign off per phase in part of a larger project. Um, we usually have sign off template documents that we are using that are part of a bigger project like an S4HANA implementation or similar. But when we deploy independently of those, it's something that I've seen a little bit neglected. So please take note of um, that recommendation, and at the end of each phase get confirmation from the customer that the agreed steps and scope for that deployment phase have been completed. Any questions? Okay, so in this workshop, we also expect the customer. So remember, we talk to the customer about what we are doing for them in terms of the service deployment. But in order to do that effectively, we need some input from them, from the perspective of what their project scope, timelines, milestones, priorities, use cases are, so that we can tailor the service that we are delivering to their requirements. I'm not going to go through each of these slides. These are the standard slides that we deliver in advance of um, the extended solution demo, a very quick overview of Enable Now, the main features of Enable Now that we are leveraging in deploying the services, and then we don't spend much time on that and go straight into the extended demo. I'll jump shortly to the internal delivery document so that you can see how that guides you through the um, execution of that demo. Once that demo is completed, we talk about the info center example. So give the customer an insight into what the output of their content production with Enable Now could typically look like by showing our info center and what's available there and how we have structured it. And in every case on these decks where you see the info center icon, there is a direct link to the info center from out of these slides, usually in the top right hand corner or bottom right hand corner. You'll find links to the topics that we are referring to. This slide will help the customer to zone in on their use cases for Enable Now and give you some insights to take note of in preparation for the enablement, as well as for the strategy analysis and design workshops, where you will at least be able at that point of the workshops to prepare a demo that speaks to their specific scenarios and use cases. The next few slides are just an explanation of the high-level production workflow, so content production, and which component of Enable Now is being used for each of the phase. So capturing instant producer, subject matter experts, potentially also with producer to develop QA, edit and localize the content, and then eventually producer and manager for the publication and general content handling, and then the combination of desktop assistant with manager or web assistant, depending on the customer's choice or preference on the actual delivery. And that's where we talk LMS if it's relevant for the customer as well. And then finally talk evaluation from a reporting perspective as far as the learner is concerned. Typically, the right-hand side of this production workflow speaks to what you are doing with the authoring apps, the instant producer and producer and partly manager, and then mainly speaking to the activities of the authoring team, and then on the left-hand side, mainly focused on the end user or the consumer of the produced content and managing them from a learning report perspective. The next few slides will look familiar if you have done the SEN 300 or 30 course, which I'm sure you all have, the Enable Now project organization options that you choose or that the customer chooses depending on their setup. So you would need, together with the customer, to identify the one that is closest to their use case and to their requirements, and then thereafter jump into the customizing and design topics so that they are prepared for the for that part of the strategy analysis and design workshops, understanding what it is exactly within Enable Now. We are able to customize and helping them to prepare for those decisions in the next phase. There are a few examples of design templates shown there from customers that have given us permission to share theirs. And then we basically summarize this part of the service or the session with ensuring that we have covered all the employment topics to ensure decision readiness for the next part of the deployment. We show the customer the details around the next part of the deployment, which is in purple there, customizing and design, information architecture, infrastructure, and technology, and also show them what's coming thereafter. Note again that we are recommending that the customer formally accepts that they have executed all the preparation steps that we would have agreed to have them prepare in the preparation phase so that there are no hiccups once on site to deliver, or there is no lack of readiness once we are on site to deliver strategy and configuration. The enablement would follow after the system is configured and ready to use, and we will have prepared or will be preparing training based on decisions made in strategy and configuration so that we tailor that enablement. If you've done enablement before, you'll know that it's simply not possible to go through every single possible topic from an enablement perspective within 3 to 5 days recommended for that phase. So you do want to ensure that you focus on the topic areas that the customer has listed and has pointed out as being what they require. There is also a checklist in advance of the next phase that helps the customer understand exactly what it is that they need to prepare. At this point, because they have seen an extended demo, they have seen some examples from the info center, from the design elements and requirements, they have a better understanding of Enable Now. They're in a position to prepare or to make sense of this preparation checklist and be able to execute accordingly. There are also some links. So you'll find the summary links to important information sources are in every deck. So this is a standard slide in all of the decks, just so that the customer and their various audiences that receive the decks will always have access to their information sources and how to get support or additional support if they require. Please bear with me. I'm just switching to the internal delivery document, but in the meantime, let me take questions. Perhaps you have some questions on the deck itself before I jump to the delivery document. Questions. On this one, or comments. Anything in the chat if you don't feel like talking, type. Okay, then I will continue. So this is the supporting document for the core team kickoff session deck that you have just seen. The flow of the deck is very similar in all of them. It gives the purpose of the deck or the purpose of the session, the intention of the session, what to do, do's and don'ts in summary, what to focus on, because this one in particular, I think, is tricky. You can fall into the trap of focusing too much or going into too much detail on a topic or elements of the topics that will be covered in later, more focused sessions. So you'll see that this is asking you to keep it crisp and short, apart from the extended demo part of the session. Everything else is just an overview. You don't talk functional details and features in depth. You pretty much focus on giving the customer an idea enough to help them get ready for the next session. So as you'll see, the session is intended to guarantee decision readiness for the core team members.
Judith,
Yes.
sorry, but I'm still seeing that summary slide from the PowerPoint.
Are you? Okay, I did forget to change my share. Thank you for that. Just a second for me. Thanks, Christina. Okay, can you see it now? I'll start from the top.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Okay, so as I mentioned, format more or less the same. In this case, the delivery guide for the core team session, you'll see a table of contents, and then the general flow of the document contains the purpose and how to execute. The execution piece is, I think, the most important for us from a guideline perspective. This is a question that we have or have seen a lot, which is how do you get started with a particular phase of deployment? What are the guidelines? What do we cover? And this is meant to give you more or less a some guidance in terms of how to execute those parts. You'll see a lot of advice in these internal delivery documents. Some of them I mentioned before, like keeping it short and crisp, avoiding details, and feature discussions that are reserved for upcoming phases, and ensuring you stick to the purpose of the session, which in this case is to ensure decision readiness for the next phases for the customer, because of the audience that is usually sitting in that core team kickoff session. We ask that you try to be non-technical or less technical and focus more on the concepts behind Enable Now, because the more technical topics should have or would have already been covered in the infrastructure sessions, as well as the technical implementation phase. And we are now talking to business in a sense, not talking to IT as such. So the guidance here is to follow the deck, ensure that you are understanding the service context, which is all covered in the deck, understanding what the customer wants to use Enable Now for and what their use cases or priorities are for the deployment. The virtual handshake and project presentation is where we ask the customer to provide inputs. As you would have seen in the deck, we have that specific slide that says, give us inputs, customer. What are your project timelines? What are your milestones? What are your priorities? And those should be taken note of by yourself as the consultant so that you can tailor the follow-on services accordingly. Again, this is more or less straightforward. What we've seen in the deck, you cover slides that help you from a guideline perspective, which topics to cover in the overview. You present the idea of EPSS, and again, always staying short, crisp, non-technical, and not talking so much as you are showing. I think it's really important in this session to focus more on demoing the elements rather than talking about it, because they're easier understood, especially by customers that are not familiar with Enable Now or similar, to be able to grasp the concepts fully. Are there any questions so far or any comments from what you see here? I won't read out or go through every single point in the demo flow perspective, but the general guidance here is to prepare a demo that shows all of the elements that you will talk about, and talk through them as you show them, rather than follow the or focus on following a slide deck. The session itself is half a day to 1 day. I think in most cases half a day, so you have enough time to get through the slides and also then focus on the actual components that you want the customer to understand. Point number 6 is showing you the demo flow suggestion for Desktop Assistant as the EPSS of choice for the customer. So if you know that this is the customer preference already, then you would follow this demo flow or this recommendation to show in detail what Desktop Assistant could look like. Any questions? I think it's always good from a obtaining sign-off from the perspective of encouraging sign-off for the completion of this phase, to document everything that you would have done in this session, document the inputs that the customer would have given. So that's why you see there in bold that you should be taking notes, you should summarize and send the minutes or the summary to the customer together with the PDF version of the used deck. And you see it again at the end to invite the customer's input into those notes if there's anything that needs to be corrected or clarified, and thereafter ensure that they give sign off or some sort of valid confirmation, usually documented confirmation via email or a sign-off document, not just verbal, to safeguard ourselves for the rest of the deployment. Unfortunately, I've seen cases where this step or this part of the recommendation is missed, and what happens is in the strategy and configuration phase or in the author enablement phase, the consultant is focusing on topics that the customer very clearly said in prior sessions they are not interested in and not focusing enough on the ones that are relevant for the customer. This also helps if there are going to be two resources used at the customer. In some cases, it could be that the technical consultant would have already come to an understanding of the customer's use cases and other inputs that we might invite in this session. So always make sure that there is an effort to touch base with the other consultant, ask them details of what the customer has already expressed, because the customer tends to get frustrated if they have already told one colleague something and that information is not filtered through to the next colleague taking over. Documenting helps. It then just becomes a case of sharing the document and the notes, and then perhaps having a shorter call to clarify and to close the loop on the previous activities.
Talking about documentation, there is one question in the chat from Verena asking about where can we find those documents. Can you say something about that?
Yes, so I have that question on Michael's table at the moment. So for now, I have permission to share the documents. I have a share folder that I am busy putting the documents into, and I would just emphasize that we are using these documents for now. There will be updates to some of them. These are guidelines. These are at the moment considered to be drafts. So use them with that in mind, that we will then officially have to remove that share once the official repository for these documents has been prepared, and that official repository is sitting within Learning Hub. So that is the plan for now. I know that there are still some discussions in the background, but in summary, there is a dedicated platform within Learning Hub from which those documents will be available, and possibly also within the JAM, but not yet confirmed. The work must go on, so for those purposes, in the meantime, we will temporarily use the share, understanding that it is temporary and that the official source for these documents will be inside of Learning Hub. I hope that helps for now. Okay, any other questions or comments? Let me show you very quickly another option for the delivery document. So this one is still a work in progress, but I think you'll find useful once it's completed. So the deck for strategy and configuration will be similar, because this is a crucial part of the deployment. You will see that this document is slightly different format-wise. It contains the screenshots from the deck itself, and then gives information on which work streams will be covered inside of that phase and their various outcomes. And what I wanted you to see here is what we are looking for from an audience perspective from the customer. So typically the expectation is that the customer should be able to look at this, or with our guidance in the previous phase, look at the scope elements for the upcoming phase and say to the customer who in your organization would be able to help us as far as decisions are concerned if we are talking about skins and templates and textiles and documentation layouts in the customization and design phase. And similarly, if we are talking about the content structure and the library that the end users or the learners will ultimately see, who in your organization will be able to guide us accordingly. So there is some guidance. I believe there is opportunity to flesh these out a little bit, and I'll provide some notes around that as well. Again, we're talking about formal sign-off being recommended for this phase, and in this particular instance, quite a detailed document that lists or provides all of the decisions and the summary of the topics that the customer and yourself discussed in those sessions. Again, the execution of the phase itself will be fleshed out, but in essence, this is what the flow of this internal delivery document will look like. It will give you some guidance in terms of what to have ready in preparation for the session. The plan is to have a pre-filled DKP file that helps you to work through the session itself. You might have seen similar as far as the recommended or the best practice content structure is concerned, and that speaks to just one of the blocks that we are covering in this workshop, which is information architecture. Ultimately, we want to offer a little bit more guidelines for customization and design, as well as infrastructure and technology topics in that one as well. So for every work stream within that workshop and in the others, the intention ultimately is to provide tools and templates that you can use as the consultant to make your life easier in terms of deploying these sessions, and of course in terms of meeting the requirement that we are driving for global standardization in the delivery of these services. Any questions or comments? Okay, so what I'd like to do now is to just post my email address in the chat, so that if you would like for me to share with you, you can just send me an email. I don't have all of your details as such from an email perspective, so if you would like me to add you to the share, please just pop me an email so that I can add you. Are there any questions or comments? What do you think of the deployment approach, the services that we're offering, the decks? Do they look good? What are your views?
Hi Judith, it's me, Christina.
Yes, hi Christina.
I really like the decks. I like the slide decks. I think it's very clear to present to customers, and I've already presented it. Yeah, I think it's
Great.
much more of an improvement than there was before. So to have a standardized approach is great. Yeah, and I'm gonna have a look at these additional documents and see what I think of them, but I think it's good to have it written down and to give a clear guidance on how to deliver the services also.
Oh, great.
So I like it.
Thanks, Christina. So what was the feedback when you presented before?
Actually, for the single services, it was sort of like, okay, that's a lot of days. But yeah, so it's good that you can sort of split it and say, well, start with the simple one, and then, you know, once you're okay with that, we can offer more days to go into more detail.
Okay.
So that was the feedback. And also
Great.
about the web assistant, the same question that Moritz had about, okay, can we just implement web assistant? That's what customers asked.
Okay, interesting. So something that is picking up an interest for them, or something that maybe a lot more customers will start to consider, from what I hear in
Yeah.
general.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Christina. Appreciate that.
Okay.
And thanks, Raymond. I did see in the chat that you also find the slides to be helpful. Thanks. Any other comments?
Hi Judith, this is Sherry.
Hi, Sherry. How are you?
I'm good. How's it doing?
Good, good.
Thank you. I think if we keep these things in practice, it will standardize the process and it will help us to maintain the quality every time when we deliver. And especially for the new consultants, I think it's so self-explanatory that we can, once if we follow step by step, you know, the process here, we'll able to deliver the project with quality from the start. So I think these are very helpful. It's just that we have to bring this in practice every time.
That's
Start
right.
use. Yeah.
Then you gain experience. And thanks for that, Sherry. I think as you do that, so once you've had a chance to do it in practice or to deliver based on this approach and on these decks in practice, please give us feedback
Sure.
from your customers or even from your own experience that will help us to keep improving.
Sure. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Okay, then I will end the session. Please remember to send me an email if you are interested in being part of the share, which I should be able to give you access to before or by the end of this week. Thank you everyone for your participation. I really appreciate your making time for this session and for the feedback, and all the best delivering Enable Now services. Thank you and goodbye.
Bye, Judith. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Judy, for presenting. Bye.
Thank you,
Bye bye.
Moritz. Bye, everyone.